Hello friends, welcome to another session of video tutorial on SQL. In today's session, we will go through SQL constraints. What are constraints? Constraints are nothing but a predefined set of rules and restrictions which are applied to a set of columns or a particular column. Constraints are needed to maintain the data integrity, accuracy, and reliability of the column's data. Since these constraints are applied to a particular column, so we want to ensure that the data which is entered into that particular column or set of columns follows some rules and restrictions, so that whenever we retrieve data, so we get a accurate data. There are few SQL constraints which are available. One is null or null. There are few constraints available: null, not null, unique, primary key, foreign key, check constraint, and default constraint. So these are the set of constraints which are available in SQL, which I'm going to go through. So what does null constraint do? So null constraint will what does null constraint do? Null constraint will allow you to add a null value to a particular column. So what does not null do? Not null will not allow you to add a null value to a particular column. Okay, so what is unique constraint? Unique constraint is the one which doesn't allow you to add duplicate values. And the next constraint is primary key. Primary key defines that a particular row is identified by a unique ID, which is primary key. So now you might ask, what is the difference between unique key and primary key? So unique key allows you to add null value, but primary key will not allow you to add null value. Unique key will allow you to add one null value. It can have one null value, but the primary key cannot be null. The next constraint is foreign key. Foreign key is the one which combines or links two tables together. So if you have table 1 and table 2, they are linked together based on the foreign key. Basically, the foreign key identifies the relationship between the two tables, like a parent and a child. So we will see an example of all of these, but let us move on to check constraint. Suppose say if you want to restrict the user by certain numbers, say for example age can be between 20 and 80, and if you want to restrict a particular age column to have only these values, then you can add a check constraint for that particular column. And the last one is a default constraint. A default constraint is used to provide a default value. For example, if you want to insert a date, which is today's date, whenever you insert a record into the table, then you can provide the default value for that is today's date. If you specify a particular date, then it will insert that particular date. Otherwise, it will insert today's date. So these are the different constraints available. We will try to create a new table and try to see each of these constraints. So we are going to create an employee table with these columns: ID, name, address, grade, department, salary, and date of joining. And while creating, we will see how to add these constraints to some of these columns. Okay, so let us go to SQL Server Management Studio, and I select the database. I'm going to create a new database here, and I'm going to call it as SQL demo. Okay, so it has created this SQL demo database. Okay, and under SQL demo, I go to table, right click, and then click on table. So this is the table which I'm going to create. The name of the table will be employee. And now I start specifying the column names. The column names which we were thinking of were ID, and the data type here is integer, and for the time being I'll leave it as it is, but I'll explain it later. We'll try to create all the columns. Then the name, and name will have varchar, varchar, and the name can be of 100 characters max. Okay, and address, again varchar, and the address can be up to 1000 characters. And the grade, which grade that employee is allotted with, again this is going to have varchar of 50. 50 is enough for a particular grade. And department, and again the department name can be again varchar of 50. And salary will be, again for simplicity I'll make it as integer, and date of joining, DOJ, and this will be a date column. Okay, so we have created all the columns now. So we will see the first constraint now. So we will see the first constraint, which is not null or null. Okay, the first constraint is, okay, here by default all these columns are added with allow nulls constraint, that is null constraint. That means all these columns can have null values, but it doesn't make sense to have a null value for an ID. So we will see each column. So ID cannot be null, and the name cannot also be null. Address, if the person or if an employee has moved from one state to another state, then he might not have a permanent address, so address can be empty at this point of time. So I will say allow nulls. So that means I'm applying null constraint to this particular column and not null to ID and name for now. Okay, every employee will have a grade, and every employee will be allocated with a department. Every employee will be paid with some salary, and he has a specific date of joining. So that means we have added not null constraint on all these columns and null constraint on address column. So we covered null and not null. So now let us see how to add unique constraint. So let me save this table first. Okay. Now the name can be same, right? The name can be same, but the ID cannot be same. So what I will do is ID and name. These are the combinations of columns, I'm going to create it as unique constraint. That means an employee can only have ID and name unique across the organization. There cannot be any duplicates. So I selected these two columns and go to index and keys, click on add, and here is unique, yes, and type will be unique key. And the columns which I need to select here is ID and name, because these are the two columns which is unique across the organization. Okay, and I'm going to call this identity as ID name unique. Okay, and click on close. So we have added ID and name as a unique constraint. Okay, now next one is primary key. So the primary key for this particular table will be ID. So I need to make this ID as primary key so that there won't be any duplicates, because two employees cannot have the same ID number. Okay, so to make it as primary key, I right click on this and set primary key. Okay, so there's a key appearing here. That means this particular table has this ID as primary key. Okay, so foreign key we will deal in the next session. Whenever we create two or more tables, and whenever we create two or more tables with the relationship between those three tables. So I can also add a check constraint here. The minimum salary is, say for example, $500, right? And I can add a constraint here saying that the salary cannot be less than $500. Okay, for that I need to right click again, and there is a check constraint. Select check constraints and click on add, and the expression which I'm going to give here is, okay, so which column? The salary column should be greater than $500. So this is the syntax, which says the salary must be greater than $500. Otherwise, it won't allow you to insert a record. And the name of this is, I'm going to check constraint salary greater than 500. Okay, and this is applicable for existing data, and when this is enforced during insert and updates, and this is enforced for replication also. Click on close. Okay, so we have added this check constraint also. So what we will do is we will add a default constraint. Suppose say if I don't provide date of joining, then it should take today's date as date of joining. Okay, so how do I ensure that? So I select the particular column which I want to make, which I want to have a default value, and under this column properties I have a default value or binding. So here for date there is a built-in function called getDate. So this is a function which fetches today's date and provides it if there is no value for this particular column. So that means it will add today's date into that particular column. Okay, so far we have added null constraint, not null constraint, unique, primary key, check constraint, and default constraint. Okay, so now we save this, and now we will add data to this particular table. Okay, for that I'm going to click on new query. Okay, so now select star from employee. Okay, so you need to make sure that you are referencing to a particular database or the specific database which you want to query on. So in my case it is SQL demo. So let me query this, execute, and there's no data here. Okay, so now I'll start adding the data into this particular table. Insert into the table name is employee, which has columns ID, name, address, ID, name, address, grade, department, salary, grade, department, salary, comma, grade, department, salary, and date of joining. And the values which I'm going to add is, for example, 1 for ID, name will be Jack in single quotes, Jack, and address is, let's say, New York, and his grade is Jack, New York, and the grade is, say, software developer 1. That's, he's joined as a new employee as software developer 1, grade 1, and department is, say, for example, big data. His salary is, say, $5,000, and date of joining is, again, today's date, which is, let's say, he joined on 2018 September month and 15th date. Okay, so let me minimize this so that we see the entire query here. Okay, so these are the values which I'm trying to insert into this particular table. Okay, let me run this query, execute. It says one row affected, and let me select the query again. Okay, you can see that Jack has been added. Okay, now we will see one by one, not null constraint, right? Okay, so everything else remains the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this here and then paste it here. What I'm going to do here is, since name is not null, I will try to add a null value into this name column. So for that I need to change this to 2 and then add null value. Okay, make sure that it is not this. So this is still a value with empty string in it. Okay, and it's not a null value. Okay, if you specify null, then it's a null value. Okay, let us try to insert this into the table. Okay, so we got cannot insert the value null into column name table column does not allow nulls. So that means it is verifying that constraint that this value cannot be null. Okay, so the next one is and then null. Okay, so which column did we define as null? So address. Okay, so instead of having null here, I'm going to add a value here. Name can be Christine and let's say dollars and C2 again big data and salary is 10,000 US dollars. Okay, and the joining date is 18 to 17. Okay, so I have changed all the values. So here we are trying to check for this null constraint. So address is Dallas, right? So I put in Dallas earlier. So I'm going to remove that. And I'm going to add null here. Okay, remember that null is different to empty string. Empty string is still a value, null is not a value. Okay, so I'm going to execute this one. Okay, you can see that it has added one row even though we provided null value because we are allowing address to have null value. Okay, so if I select, I should have two entries. Okay, you can see the address is null here. Okay, so we have seen not null and null. Okay, the next one which we will see is the primary key. Okay, the primary key is unique across the entire table. So the primary key is unique across the table and we added ID as a primary key. Okay, so here that means we cannot have okay, we have added ID as a primary key earlier. So that means ID cannot have duplicate values. So let us try to insert this, the first SQL statement with the values. So one already exists. So I will say Jill and this I can say Texas and SD2 and this is IT infrastructure and okay the date will be say for example 12. Okay, so here ID already exists, ID1 already exists. So if I try to execute this, then it should give me a violation of primary key constraints. That means I cannot add the same value for that ID, even though everything else, all the other columns are different. Since this ID already exists, it doesn't allow me to have another value with the same ID. So that means it is checking for this primary key constraint. Okay, so let us check at unique constraint. Okay, since we added ID and name as unique constraint, since ID also has a primary key constraint, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this primary key constraint for the time being, just to check for this particular unique constraint, because if I add another value here with this ID constraint, then it will check for primary key, not for the unique constraint. So that is why I have removed primary key here, and I'm going to save this. Okay, and I'm going to copy this, the second statement. Okay, so unique constraint in our case is ID and the name. Okay, and I'm going to change everything else here. Okay, so here SD3 and big data platform team, and here I'm going to say it as 6,000, and I've changed the so everything else is changed except ID and name is the unique constraint, and it cannot have duplicate values. Okay, so to and Christine is already added with the different values for all the other columns, and I'm trying to add the same with different values for all other columns except these two columns which already exist. Okay, let me execute this. Okay, as you can see, it is a violation of unique key constraint. The name of the constraint is ID name unique. Cannot insert duplicate key in object employee. The duplicate key value is 2 and Christine. So if I change the value to 3 and execute this, it should allow me to add a new value. Okay, so this is how unique key constraint works. Okay, let me add the primary key again back. So save this. Now we have seen unique, not null, null, primary key, and we will check for check constraint. Okay, so we'll add another one here. Check constraint. The check constraint says the salary has to be greater than 500. So I will add another employee. Okay. So instead of providing all the column names, so I'll provide just the values here. Values. And I'm adding a fourth entry, and the name can be Joe, and Joe is from Washington, and he's team leader 1. Grade is team leader 1, and he belongs to, let's say, finance team, and his salary is $300, and he joined 2016 03 and 15. Okay, So whenever I remove these column names, I must have all the column values here. So I have all the column values here. 4 represents ID, and Joe represents name, Washington represents address, TL1 represents grade, finance represents department, and salary represents 300 represents salary, and this is the date of joining. Okay, so let us execute this. Okay, so here you can see the insert statement conflicted with the check constraint CC salary greater than 500. The conflict occurred in the database SQL demo table DB employee column salary. So that means the salary constraint is checked here. It won't allow us to insert any new row with salary less than 500. So I will make it as 3000 and insert it. Okay, one row affected. So let us go back and select all the employees. So Joe is inserted and his salary is 3000. Okay, so that's our check constraint. Now let us look at the default constraint. Okay. What does default constraint say? Default constraint says if I don't provide any value, which column did we add default constraint to? Date of joining. So what this does is if I don't provide any value to this date of joining, then it will take today's date. Okay. So here I will copy this and paste it here, and I won't provide any value here. So I will completely remove this, and I will change the ID and Maria, and she's from Brazil, and she is team lead grade 2, and she is in procurement department, and her salary is, let's say, 5000. Okay. Now I have not provided the column value for date of joining, so it should pick up a current date. So let me insert this. Okay, as I said earlier, whenever we provide only values, then we should provide the values for all the columns. So since I'm missing date of joining, so I need to provide the column names as well. Okay. I'm going to take out the date of joining. So let me execute this. Okay, so one row affected. So now let us go back and see whether Maria has been added to our table or not. Okay, so Maria is added and the default date is being added, even though we didn't provide any date value here, but it added the current date as date of joining. Okay, so we have seen all of these constraints except foreign key, which we will deal with in the next session. Okay, so that's all about SQL constraints.